My name is Elizabeth Parker. I'm 42 years old, and I watched my 15-year marriage dissolve in the middle of a crowded ballroom. What my husband didn't know was that I was the one who lit the match, and I was about to walk away with his future in my pocket. This is my story. It's been a long road, and I'm telling it now because I know I'm not the only one who has ever felt invisible in their own life. As you settle in to listen, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It makes me feel a little less alone, knowing we're all connected, sharing these moments together. The air in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was thick with the cloying scent of money, lilies, and unspoken betrayals. It was the annual Riverside Foundation Gala, the glittering apex of our city's philanthropic season, an event I once anticipated with a flutter of excitement. Tonight, however, the gilded walls felt like they were closing in, the crystal chandeliers casting a light that was too bright, too revealing. From my strategic position near a towering ice sculpture of a swan, I had a perfect, agonizingly clear view of the dance floor. And of my husband, Robert. He wasn't dancing with me. He was dancing with Victoria Reynolds. Victoria was a junior attorney at his firm, Garrison, Whitmore and Associates. She was 28, with hair the color of aged whiskey and a laugh that cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. Their movements weren't a waltz or even a foxtrot. A waltz has structure, a respectable distance. What they were engaged in was a slow, languid performance of possession, a public seduction set to the melancholy strains of a string quartet. Robert's hand was splayed on the small of Victoria's back, his fingers tracing lazy circles on the emerald satin of her gown, dipping dangerously low. Her head was tilted back, her lips parted in a silent invitation as she gazed up at him. The smile they exchanged was a disgusting, intimate secret shared in a room of 1,000 people. My husband, a man who hadn't truly looked at me, not with any real interest in years, was looking at this girl as if she were a newly discovered constellation. A wave of cold nausea washed over me, so intense I had to grip the edge of my table to steady myself. The crystal flute of champagne in my hand felt slick with a sudden, clammy sweat. It wasn't just the infidelity. I'd suspected that for months. The late nights at the office that stretched until 2 a.m., the faint, unfamiliar scent of a floral perfume clinging to his suits, the way he angled his phone away from me whenever a text message chimed. Those were the clues, the breadcrumbs of his deceit. No, this was something far more corrosive. This was public humiliation. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was methodically, cruelly erasing me. He was making me a spectator to the demolition of my own life, forcing me to watch from the cheap seats. I could feel the sidelong glances from the other wives, the women I'd served on charity committees with, the ones whose children had grown up with ours before we realized we couldn't have any. Their faces were masks of polite sympathy, but their eyes held a different story, a mixture of pity and a morbid, self-satisfied curiosity. "You're a poor thing. Thank God it's not me." But I wasn't a poor thing. I was a 42-year-old woman with a Juris Doctorate degree from Stanford University, a woman who had willingly, lovingly placed her own fierce ambitions in a box and stored them in the attic to make room for his. I had been the architect of his social success, the gracious hostess, the silent partner who managed his home, his schedule, and his fragile ego. I was the perfect corporate wife, an elegant accessory he could display at events just like this one. And now, the accessory had become outdated, ready to be discarded for a newer, shinier model. A voice, my mother's voice, echoed in my memory as clear and sharp as the day she'd spoken the words from her hospice bed. "Ellie, you don't ever let any man, not even one you love, make you a supporting character in your own story. You were born to be the lead." She had seen it even then. She had seen the subtle shift in Robert as his career took off, the way his confidence curdled into arrogance, his partnership into ownership. For years, I had dismissed her warning, telling myself that this was the nature of a long marriage, a delicate dance of compromise and sacrifice. But looking at Robert and Victoria, entwined under the glittering lights, I finally understood the brutal truth. This wasn't a partnership. It was a hostile takeover, and I had been quietly liquidated. My heart wasn't breaking. That had happened slowly, over years of quiet neglect. No, this was something else. My heart was hardening, crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and diamond hard. The grief I thought I would feel was incinerated by a sudden white-hot rage. I was done, not just with the marriage, but with the role I had been playing for 15 years. With a calmness that felt utterly alien and yet completely natural, I set my untouched champagne flute down. I began to walk, my steps deliberate and unhurried, my heels sinking into the plush Persian rug. I moved through the crowd like a phantom, my eyes locked on my target. They didn't see me coming. They were lost in their own sordid little world, a universe of two. I stopped at a small, marble-topped cocktail table just a few feet from where they were swaying. Slowly, I twisted the platinum wedding band from my finger. 15 years of my life, of my loyalty, of my sacrificed dreams, compressed into a single, cool circle of metal. I remembered the day he placed it there, and a small church filled with sunlight and promises. Those promises now felt like a cruel joke, words spoken by a stranger. I placed the ring on the table. It made a soft, definitive clink against the cold marble, a sound that seemed to reverberate in the sudden silence of my mind. It was the full stop at the end of a very long, very painful chapter. I leaned in, just close enough for him to hear me if he were actually listening, though I knew he wasn't. I whispered, "Keep dancing, Robert." My voice was a thread of ice. Then I turned, my back straight, my chin high, and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked past the melting swan, past the oblivious string quartet, past the pitying eyes of the society wives. I pushed open the heavy, ornate ballroom doors and stepped into the cool, quiet hallway. The muffled music faded behind me, the soundtrack to a life that was no longer mine. I was no longer Elizabeth Parker, the wife of the prominent attorney. I was just Elizabeth. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like everything. The memory of that night at the Gala is seared in my mind like a brand, a cinematic final scene. But the real beginning of the end, the moment the first hairline fracture in the foundation of my world appeared, had occurred 3 months prior. On a quiet, sun-drenched Tuesday afternoon, I was in my home office, a room I had designed myself, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large bay window that overlooked the rose garden I had spent years cultivating. This room was my sanctuary, the headquarters for my small but successful interior design business, a venture Robert patronizingly referred to as my little hobby. More importantly, it was where I meticulously managed the finances for the Eleanor Memorial Fund. My mother, Eleanor, had been a painter. She wasn't famous, but her canvases were filled with a fierce, joyful light. Her dying wish, whispered to me through a haze of morphine, was to ensure that children in the city's most neglected neighborhoods had the chance to find their own light through art. With the inheritance she left me, I established the fund to provide free art classes, supplies, and mentorship to local shelters and community centers. It was a small-scale operation, but it was the most vital, meaningful work of my life. It was my promise to her, a living, breathing piece of her soul. That afternoon, I was preparing the quarterly report for the fund's board, a board of 2, myself and my mother's old friend, Judge Miller. I was a meticulous bookkeeper, a habit ingrained from my days studying contract law at Stanford. Every dollar was accounted for, or so I had always believed. As I reconciled the bank statements, my brow furrowed in confusion. There was a wire transfer out of the fund's main account for $75,000. It was dated 2 months prior. The memo line was brief and cryptic. Pinecrest Capital Loan. Pinecrest. The name rang a loud, clanging bell. It was a massive commercial real estate development Robert's firm was handling. He'd been boasting about it for months, calling it a legacy project. My blood rang cold. It had to be a mistake,
A clerical error at the bank. I started cross-referencing the numbers, my fingers flying across the keyboard, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. There was no mistake. The money was gone. A frantic, desperate energy seized me. I started digging deeper, a digital archaeologist unearthing a buried crime. I moved from the funds accounts to our personal finances. For years, Robert had handled the big picture finances, investments, taxes, our mortgage, assuring me it was more efficient. "You focus on your hobby, honey. I'll handle the serious stuff," he'd say, patting my head as if I were a child. Now his condescension felt like a deliberate smokescreen. Using a login he'd given me years ago for tax purposes and had long since forgotten about, I accessed our joint mortgage account online. The page loaded and the air was sucked from my lungs. Our home, the beautiful colonial on a tree-lined street in the city's most desirable neighborhood, the house we had celebrated paying off 5 years ago with a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon, the place I'd brought my mother to live in her final painful days, it had a new, active lien against it. A lien for a staggering sum of $850,000. My hands trembled so violently I could barely control the mouse. I clicked on the loan documents, which were available as PDFs. The digital signatures were there. Robert Parker. And right next to his, a clumsy, arrogant forgery of my own name, Elizabeth Parker. It was a grotesque imitation, one that captured the shape of my signature, but none of its spirit. He had remortgaged our home, our biggest asset, the very symbol of our shared life, without my knowledge or consent. That evening, I waited for him in the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, the printed documents laid out on the polished surface of the coffee table like an indictment. When he walked in, whistling, loosening his expensive silk tie, he flicked on the lights and saw my face. His smile faltered. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice wary as he gestured to the papers. "I was hoping you could tell me, Robert," I said, my own voice dangerously calm, devoid of the hysteria he so clearly expected. "I didn't realize we were in the business of borrowing nearly $1 million against our home, or that my mother's tiny charity was providing capital loans to your multi-million-dollar clients." He scanned the documents, and for a fleeting, satisfying second, I saw a flash of pure panic in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of weary annoyance. "Oh, for God's sake, Elizabeth, you're making a mountain out of a molehill." "$1 million molehill, Robert? You forged my signature. That's a felony." "It was a temporary liquidity solution for the Pinecrest deal," he said, waving a dismissive hand as he walked to the antique bar cart to pour himself a scotch. "It's just business, the kind of thing you wouldn't understand." "I have a law degree from Stanford," I shot back, my voice rising despite my best efforts to control it. "Try me." He turned, his face hardening into the cruel, imperious mask I'd seen him use on opposing counsel in court. "That was a long time ago. This is the real world. That little fund of yours, the one you pour all your time into, barely makes enough to cover its own administrative fees. I took a short-term, fully secured loan. The money will be back in the account with interest before your next quarterly report is even due. You wouldn't have even noticed if you weren't so obsessed with playing accountant with your pocket money." The casual cruelty of his words, the way he belittled the one thing that was sacred to me, struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about the money. It was the utter contempt he had for me, for my intelligence, for my mother's legacy. "You stole from my mother's grave, Robert." The words were a choked whisper, torn from my throat. "Don't be so dramatic," he scoffed, taking a long swallow of his drink. His eyes were cold, devoid of any remorse. "Your mother would be proud that her money is finally being put to good use, helping to build something real and lasting instead of funding a few finger painting classes. Honestly, Elizabeth, you should be thanking me." That was it. That was the precise moment my love for him died. It didn't fade away. It was executed right there in our beautifully decorated living room under the soft glow of the chandelier I had picked out. I looked at the man I had spent 15 years of my life with, the man I had supported and championed, and I saw a stranger, a thief, a hollow man who could desecrate a memory to fund his own ambition. The fight was over before it had truly begun. I knew then that I wouldn't win an argument with him. He was too skilled at twisting words, at making me feel small and hysterical. But I also knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones like a layer of glacial ice that I would win the war. He had just handed me all the ammunition I would ever need. For 2 days after that soul-crushing confrontation, I moved through my life like a ghost in my own home. I made coffee I didn't drink, watered the garden I didn't see, and nodded through Robert's self-important monologues about his day at the firm. On the outside, I was the same compliant, supportive wife he had come to expect. On the inside, a silent, seismic revolution was taking place. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He thought I was a relic from a past life, a decorative object to be polished and displayed. He was about to find out that relics can be weapons. On the third day, while Robert was at a golf outing with a client, I went up to the attic. The air was warm and still, smelling of cedar and aging paper. In the farthest corner, behind a stack of Robert's old college textbooks on political science, was a sealed storage box labeled E. Parker, Stanford. I took a box cutter and sliced through the yellowed packing tape. Inside, nestled in layers of acid-free tissue paper, were my old law books, my meticulously organized notes from torts and contracts, and at the very bottom, my framed Juris Doctor degree.
I lifted the heavy frame, wiping a layer of dust from the glass. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal of Stanford University. I had graduated cum laude. I had been an editor on the law review. I remembered the fire I'd had then, the insatiable hunger to argue, to build cases, to deconstruct an opponent's logic piece by piece. I had traded it all for Robert's dream, naively believing it was our dream. What a fool I'd been. Holding that diploma, I felt a profound shift within me. I wasn't just a scorned wife anymore. I was a lawyer. And I was about to take on the most important case of my life. My first client was me. My first move wasn't emotional. It was ruthlessly practical. I went back to my sun-drenched office and pulled up the files for my little hobby, Parker Interiors, LLC. Robert had always laughed at the formality of the LLC, saying it was adorable that I was playing businesswoman. He had no idea of the truth. When my mother passed, her inheritance wasn't just the seed money for the foundation. There was a separate, substantial portfolio of stocks and bonds she had left solely to me. Her final piece of advice to me, along with the warning about Robert, was financial. "Never put all your eggs in one basket, Ellie," she had said, her voice thin but her eyes sharp. "Especially not in a basket held by someone else. You build your own nest." And I had. For 10 years, I had quietly and diligently funneled the profits from that private portfolio through my design business. I treated the dividends and capital gains as income from high-end clients, creating a paper trail that was both legal and discreet. I reinvested, I diversified, I made my own savvy plays in the market. I had taught myself about finance, devouring the Wall Street Journal and Barron's while Robert read the sports pages. Because it was my hobby, a venture he considered beneath his notice, he never once asked to see the books. His arrogance was his undoing. It was the ultimate, glorious blind spot. I logged into my private brokerage account, my heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The number on the screen glowed back at me, a beacon in the darkness of the past few days. $1.6 million. It was my money, my secret, untouched and unknown by Robert. A profound sense of power surged through me, a feeling I hadn't realized I'd been missing for so long.
It wasn't about the money itself, it was about the validation. The proof that I was not the flighty, incompetent woman he saw me as. I was smart, I was capable. I had been all along. The $850,000 he'd stolen from our home and the $75,000 he'd siphoned from my mother's sacred fund were the final, unforgivable insults. But now, combined with my own funds, I had a clear, unobstructed path to freedom. I had the means. Now I needed the method. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Robert was a shark. His law firm was a tank of sharks. A standard divorce proceeding would be a bloodbath. He would drag it out for years, bury me in paperwork, and use his considerable resources to paint me as an unstable, grasping, vindictive woman. He would use his power and connections to crush me into dust. I couldn't fight him on his turf. I had to create a new one. I scrolled through the contacts on my personal laptop, my finger hovering over a name I hadn't called in years. Marcus Chen. We had been inseparable in college, two nerdy outcasts who survived on caffeine, cheap pizza, and a shared passion for debate. After graduation, he'd gone west to Silicon Valley and become a quiet legend in the cybersecurity world. We exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional birthday email, but life, as it does, had pulled us in different directions. I knew, from a sad, brief email a few years back, that he had gone through a brutal divorce himself, one involving digital espionage and hidden offshore accounts. He would understand. He wouldn't just offer sympathy, he would offer strategy. My finger hovered over the call button. This was the point of no return. The moment I made this call, the life I knew, the comfortable, gilded cage I had lived in for 15 years, would be over. The future was a terrifying, unknown landscape. But the present, I realized with sudden, stark clarity, was a slow, suffocating death. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a new, steely resolve, and pressed the button. It rang twice. Liz? His voice was just as I remembered it, warm and a little surprised, cutting through 20 years of distance. Is everything okay? Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed, tears of rage and grief and a decade of swallowed disappointments, finally came, hot and silent. No, Marcus, I whispered, my voice breaking on his name. Nothing is okay. I need your help. I'm in serious trouble. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then his voice came back. No longer surprised, but firm, steady, and full of the same unwavering loyalty I remembered from our all-night study sessions 20 years ago. Tell me everything, he said. Whatever you need. I'm on the next flight out. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't a ghost in my own home anymore. I was a general, and I had just recruited my first soldier. The war had officially begun. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Marcus in a quiet, anonymous coffee shop in a town 30 miles from my home. He had flown in overnight, no questions asked, a testament to a friendship that time had not eroded. He looked older, of course, with fine lines around his eyes and flecks of silver at his temples, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intensely intelligent, and kind. I told him everything. I laid out the whole ugly, sordid story, from the years of subtle dismissals and growing contempt to the forged signatures and the desecration of my mother's fund. I didn't cry. My voice was level, almost clinical, as I presented the facts of the case. I had my law degree back in my mind, and I was making my opening statement. When he finished, Marcus was silent for a long time, slowly stirring his black coffee, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. I recognized the look on his face. It was the look of a man who had seen this particular battlefield before and knew exactly how to navigate its treacherous terrain. His mistake, he said, finally, his voice low and hard, his eyes meeting mine, was thinking you were a liability. He forgot you were an asset. A highly intelligent, deeply underestimated asset, he said. He leaned forward, a flicker of the old firebrand I knew from our college debate team igniting in his expression. Okay, Liz, we're not going to play defense.
We are not going to react. We are going to play offense. We are not aiming for a fair divorce settlement. We're aiming for a total, scorched earth annihilation. His words sent a shiver down my spine, a terrifying, exhilarating mixture of fear and validation. What do you have in mind? We can't beat him in a courtroom brawl, he explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He'll use every trick in the book to paint you as vindictive and emotionally unstable. So we make the courtroom irrelevant. We need to get you out, clean and silent, with every penny that rightfully belongs to you. And in the process, we need to build an evidence locker so airtight, so damning, that if he ever even thinks about coming after you, he'll be facing professional ruin and potential jail time. For the next 2 hours, that corner booth and a generic coffee shop became our war room. Marcus's mind was a marvel of strategic thinking. He thought in terms of systems, firewalls, backdoors, and vulnerabilities. And Robert, he explained, was one giant, arrogant vulnerability. First, we protect you, he said, pulling a small, sealed box from his sleek briefcase. This is a new laptop and a new phone. They're clean, military-grade encrypted. From this moment on, you do not use your old devices for anything related to this plan. Assume Robert is monitoring your digital footprint, consciously or not. These new devices are a black box. Our black box. He then laid out the plan, a multi-pronged strategy that was both brilliant and terrifying in its scope. My role was to continue playing the part of the oblivious, slightly depressed wife. I would go about my days, tend my garden, and let him think he was getting away with everything. Meanwhile, I would be meticulously gathering physical evidence, bank statements, loan agreements, credit card bills, anything with his signature on it, anything that could establish a pattern of financial control and deceit. Marcus's role was the digital extraction. He handed me a tiny USB drive that looked like a simple phone charger adapter. This contains a piece of software I wrote myself. Next time you have a few minutes alone in his study, plug this into his computer. It will look like it's just a power source. It will take less than 5 minutes to clone his entire hard drive. Emails, documents, browser history, deleted files, everything. It will be our treasure trove. The most brilliant part of his plan, however, concerned my escape and my new identity. He advised against the dramatic, movie-style creation of a fake identity, a Jane Doe with a new social security number. That's amateur hour, he said dismissively. It's illegal, it's messy, and it leaves a trail a mile wide. The smart move, the professional move, is to operate in plain sight, using the very tools of the system he thinks he controls. That's when Sophia Taylor was born. Sophia Taylor is not a person, Marcus explained, sketching a diagram on a napkin. Sophia Taylor is a company, a legal entity. We're going to form a single-member LLC registered in Delaware for maximum privacy and asset protection. You, Elizabeth Parker, will be the sole anonymous owner. This LLC will be the fortress for your assets. It's your financial escape vehicle. It was genius. It was legal. It was something Robert himself would have advised a client to do. Over the next few weeks, following Marcus's precise encrypted instructions, I became a master of espionage in my own home. I formed Sophia Taylor LLC online, a process that was surprisingly simple. I opened a new set of bank accounts under the LLC's name at a different bank, one Robert had no connection with, using the initial funds from my private investment portfolio. The transfer was completely legal, an owner moving funds into their own company. The day I cloned Robert's hard drive, my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it from the shower upstairs where he was singing off-key. I slipped into his study, the tiny USB drive feeling as heavy as a grenade in my hand. I plugged it in. A small, discrete progress bar appeared on the screen. It felt like the longest 4 minutes of my life. The moment it finished, I ejected the drive, slipped it into my pocket, and walked out, my breathing shallow and tight. I had his entire digital life. I had every email to Victoria, every damning financial document, every secret. The final step was to move the money,
I transferred the secured $1.6 million from my private account into the Sophia Taylor accounts. Then I liquidated a portion of our joint stock portfolio, my half, which I was legally entitled to as marital property, and transferred that as well. Lastly, I calculated my equity in the house based on its pre-fraud value and moved that amount from our joint savings. All told, the Sophia Taylor LLC now held just over $2.4 million, my money, my freedom, my war chest. I was no longer just playing a part. I was becoming someone new, someone who understood the mechanics of power. Robert thought power was about shouting in boardrooms and intimidating opponents. I was learning that true power was silent. It was in the details. It was in the meticulous, patient preparation for a battle the enemy doesn't even know is coming. And my arsenal was now fully, devastatingly loaded. As the weeks bled into months, my life became a masterclass in duality. To Robert, I was a woman slowly succumbing to a midlife malaise. I became more withdrawn, more listless. I feigned headaches to get out of tedious dinner parties. I skipped social events he deemed important. And I let the once perfect roses in my garden go just a little bit wild. I was playing the part of the woman slowly fading into the background, and he, utterly consumed by his own self-importance and his torrid affair with Victoria, bought the performance completely. He saw my retreat not as a sign of a gathering storm, but as a confirmation of my weakness, and it made him sloppy. This quiet period, this eye of the hurricane, allowed me to focus on the final, crucial pieces of my strategy. Marcus and I had a treasure trove of digital evidence from Robert's hard drive, a damning archive of his deceit. But I knew that in a fight this dirty, one that could potentially devolve into a he said that, she said that battle of wills, human testimony could be the tipping point. There was only one person I could think of who had seen the truth up close: Maria. Maria had been our housekeeper for over a decade. She had come to us shortly after I'd lost my father and had been a quiet, steady, almost invisible presence in our home ever since. She had adored my mother, and during Eleanor's last few months living with us, Maria had treated her with a tenderness and respect that went far beyond the duties of her job. She wasn't just scaff, she was family. And Maria saw everything. I found her in the kitchen one afternoon, polishing the silver from our wedding register, her movements methodical and precise. The irony was not lost on me. "Maria," I began, my voice soft, trying to keep the tremor out of it, "can I talk to you for a moment?" She looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes full of a knowing sadness. She had seen the shift in our home, the hollowness that had crept into the corners like a persistent mold. "Of course, Mrs. Parker." I didn't ask her to take sides. I didn't mention the word divorce. I simply placed a copy of the fraudulent mortgage document on the clean granite countertop next to a copy of my true signature. "Maria, I need you to look at this signature, and then this one. As you know, my mother's foundation is being audited. It's very important that all the paperwork is correct." She wiped her hands on her starched white apron and studied the papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the clumsy, forged Elizabeth Parker with her fingertip. She didn't say anything for a long, tense moment. Then she looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "For 2, maybe 3 weeks before your mother's funeral, Mr. Robert was in his study every night. He had papers, many papers with your name on them. He was practicing. I saw him, through the door. It was late. He was practicing signing your name, over and over." The air left my lungs in a painful rush. The casual, premeditated cruelty of it was staggering. He had been planning this betrayal even as my mother was dying in the room down the hall.
He thought I was just cleaning the upstairs hallway, Maria continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. He did not see me, but I saw him. She pushed the document back toward me. "My memory is very good, Mrs. Parker. If someone, a lawyer perhaps, needs to ask me what I saw, I will tell them the truth. For your mother, she was a good woman." I reached out and squeezed her hand, my throat too thick with emotion to speak. I had my witness.
a witness with unimpeachable credibility. A few days later, a second, far more unexpected and powerful ally emerged from the digital ether of Robert's cloned hard drive. Marcus had been sifting through the thousands of emails, flagging anything related to the Pinecrest development. He called me one night, his voice crackling with an excitement he couldn't contain. "You are not going to believe this," he said. "You know David Chen, right? The senior partner at the firm, the quiet one?" "Of course," I said. David was old school, a respected, almost revered figure who had been with the firm for 30 years. Robert always treated him with a thin veneer of respect that barely concealed a deep-seated condescension, calling him a dinosaur and a relic behind his back. "Well, our dinosaur has been getting royally screwed over by your husband," Marcus said. "I found a protected email chain between Robert and the Pinecrest developers. It turns out, to secure the initial round of funding, Robert used David Chen's name and his sterling reputation as a personal guarantor on a multi-million-dollar bridge loan, but he significantly misrepresented the risks of the project to David. He cooked the books, Liz. He made it look like a sure thing." "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means," Marcus said, his voice triumphant, "that if Pinecrest goes belly up, it's not just the outside investors who get burned. David Chen's personal reputation and a significant portion of his own retirement funds are on the line. He put him in the firing line without his full knowledge or consent. He thinks it's a standard, low-risk deal. He has no idea the whole thing is a house of cards propped up by the stolen mortgage money from your house." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. We didn't need to find a disgruntled colleague to leak information. We had found a victim, a powerful, respected victim who had everything to lose if Robert's labyrinth of schemes came to light. David Chen wasn't just a potential ally. He was a powder keg waiting for a match. I saved the damning email chain to a secure folder labeled The Chen Contingency. The plan was solidifying, becoming more formidable, more elegant than I had ever imagined. I had the money, I had the legal structure, I had the digital evidence, I had a human witness. And now I had a powerful, unwitting ally deep inside the enemy's own camp. All that was left was to choose the time and place for the detonation. And I had the perfect evening in mind, the Riverside Foundation Gala. The very stage where he intended to publicly humiliate me would become the scene of his spectacular downfall. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of Robert Parker's career, and I would be the one directing the show from the shadows. A new strategy, audacious and terrifyingly bold, was forming in my mind, a battle plan born of fury and necessity. "I'm not going west," I said. "Book me a one-way ticket to New York. I'm leaving the night of the gala, right after I walk out that ballroom door." "To do what? Confront him? Liz, that's too risky." "No," I said, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips for the first time. "Not to confront him. To get there first. He thinks he's running toward his new kingdom. He has no idea he's walking into a perfectly laid, perfectly timed trap. He wants to fight in Manhattan. Fine. I'll choose the battlefield, and I'll burn it to the ground before he even sets foot on it." The race was on. My departure from the gala was no longer just a symbolic act of leaving my marriage. It was a starting gun. While he was basking in the glow of his affair and the admiration of his peers, I would be setting up my command post in the very city he thought would be the site of his greatest triumphs. He was planning to erase me, but I was going to make sure that by the time he arrived in New York, the only thing waiting for him was the spectacular, public implosion of his carefully constructed world. The prey had just decided to become the predator. The night of the gala arrived, cloaked in an unsettling, surreal calm. As I fastened the clasp on my pearl necklace, my mother's pearls, a final touch of armor, I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I saw a woman I barely recognized. The familiar face was there, but the eyes held a depth of resolve, a chilling focus that felt both foreign and deeply, authentically my own. Robert, adjusting his perfectly knotted bow tie in the doorway, cleared his throat, a sound of mild impatience. "You look nice, Elizabeth," he said, his tone distracted, his eyes already looking past me toward the evening ahead. His compliment felt like a crumb tossed to a dog, a perfunctory gesture before the main event. He was already somewhere else, his mind in another city with another woman. I simply nodded, a silent understudy playing her final, pivotal scene. The first few hours at the gala unfolded exactly as I had foreseen, a painful tableau of social niceties, the forced smiles, the air kisses that never landed, and finally, the sickening spectacle on the dance floor. When I placed my wedding ring on that cold marble table and walked away, it was with the weightless, untethered feeling of an astronaut severing a connection to a dying ship. Marcus was waiting for me outside, parked a block away from the St. Regis, in an unassuming black sedan with tinted windows. I slipped into the passenger seat, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. The adrenaline was pumping, but my hands were steady. "It's done," I said, my voice even. "Welcome to your first day, Sophia," he replied, a grim, determined smile on his face as he pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering facade of the hotel and my old life behind us in the rearview mirror. We drove for 2 hours in near silence, heading east into the darkness. We didn't go to an airport. We went to a small, secluded cabin Marcus had rented for me deep in the woods of the Massachusetts Berkshires. This was my chrysalis, the transitional space where Elizabeth Parker would finish her transformation into the formidable, untouchable entity known as Sophia Taylor. For 3 days, I didn't speak to anyone but Marcus, who acted as my gatekeeper to the outside world. I slept for 10 hours a night, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. I ate simple, nourishing food. I walked for hours among the tall, silent pines, the crisp autumn air clearing the last vestiges of my old life from my lungs. I shed the skin of Elizabeth Parker, the society wife. I practiced signing Sophia Taylor on legal documents until it felt natural. I rehearsed the backstory we had created for my LLC, a discreet, high-level consulting firm specializing in corporate restructuring and crisis management. It wasn't a lie, it was my future. On the third day, my new life officially began. Marcus drove me to a small regional airport in Albany. I was no longer wearing a ball gown and pearls. I was dressed in tailored charcoal trousers, a cream-colored silk blouse, and a sharp, well-cut blazer. My hair, which I had worn long for years because Robert liked it that way, was now cut into a chic, no-nonsense bob that grazed my jawline. I looked like a woman who meant business. At the security gate, Marcus handed me my new encrypted phone. "Everything is loaded and ready to deploy," he said, his tone serious. "The complete evidence locker, our secure communication channel, the financial portals, the dossiers are prepared and addressed. All you have to do is give the command." Thank you, Marcus, I said, my voice thick with gratitude that words could not possibly capture. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you. He underestimated you, Liz, he said, using my old name one last time. That's on him. Now go raise hell. I boarded the flight to New York. As the plane ascended, I looked down at the patchwork of lights below, feeling a profound sense of dislocation, of being suspended between two worlds. I was leaving everything I had ever known, but for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was flying toward myself, not away from something. I landed at LaGuardia and took a black car into the city. Manhattan rose up to meet me, a forest of steel and glass, glittering with a raw, unapologetic ambition that mirrored my own. It was overwhelming and intoxicating. Robert and Victoria were coming here to conquer it. I was here to burn their plans to the ground. I checked into the Carlyle, a bastion of old New York elegance and, more importantly, legendary discretion. My suite was booked and prepaid under the Sophia Taylor LLC. From my window, I had a sweeping, panoramic view of Central Park. Just a few blocks away, I knew, was the gleaming, iconic Seagram building on Park Avenue, the location of the office tower where Robert planned to hold his make-or-break meeting with the Hudson Spire investors in less than 2 weeks. My first few days in New York were a blur of focused strategic activity. I wasn't hiding, I was establishing a beachhead. I set up meetings with a local attorney and a financial advisor to legitimize the presence of Sophia Taylor LLC in New York. I was building a foundation of credibility, creating a paper trail that showed a legitimate business entity setting up shop in the city. All the while, I watched. Through the secure channels Marcus had set up, I tracked Robert's digital breadcrumbs. I knew when he booked his first-class flights, when he arranged for movers to pack up his office, when he sent a gushing, nauseating email to Victoria about our new life and our kingdom in the sky. Each piece of information was a fresh confirmation of his breathtaking arrogance, of his absolute certainty that I was a non-factor, a piece of his past he had already swept away like so much dust. The stage was set. The actors were moving into their final positions. Robert and Victoria were about to arrive in their new city, flushed with victory and anticipation. They were preparing to raise the curtain on their spectacular future. They had no idea that I was already in the theater, hidden in the wings, with my hand on the rope that controlled the heavy velvet curtain, and I was about to bring it crashing down on their heads.
The day of Robert's big meeting dawned gray and overcast, the sky over Manhattan the color of unpolished steel. A fitting, pathetic fallacy, I thought, as I stood by the expansive window of my suite at the Carlyle, a cup of steaming English breakfast tea warming my hands. I had a clear, direct view of the Seagram building on Park Avenue, its iconic bronze facade looking somber and imposing in the flat morning light. On the 38th floor, in a glass-walled conference room with a billion-dollar view, my husband was about to pitch the deal of a lifetime, the deal that would cement his new empire. My hotel suite had been transformed into a quiet, efficient command center. On the large mahogany desk, my secure laptop was open to 2 different windows. One was a live newsfeed aggregator, set to monitor the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and Reuters. The other was a secure, end-to-end encrypted messaging app connected directly to Marcus. My heart, which I had expected to be pounding, was surprisingly calm. The frantic anxiety of the past months had been burned away, leaving behind a singular, sharp focus. This was not about revenge, I told myself. This was about consequences. This was about justice. At precisely 9 a.m., as the meeting was scheduled to begin, I initiated the 2-pronged protocol we had rehearsed a dozen times. My first target was David Chen. I knew from Robert's leaked calendar that David was attending a legal conference in Chicago, but I also knew that a man like David was never truly disconnected. On my laptop, I opened a pre-written, encrypted email. It was from a generic, untraceable address we had created, concerned.colleague@protonmail.com. The subject line was simple, designed to bypass any assistant and demand immediate attention. Urgent and confidential, your personal exposure to the Pinecrest development. The body of the email was concise, professional, and devastating. It laid out the facts of Robert's deceit in cold, hard terms, referencing specific clauses in the loan documents Robert had lied to him about. It attached the key pieces of evidence from Robert's own hard drive, compiled into a neat PDF: the fraudulent mortgage agreement on my home, the illegal wire transfer from my mother's foundation, and, most damningly, the email chain where Robert boasted to the Pinecrest developers about how he had handled his dinosaur of a partner to get the deal done. It was a neat, undeniable, career-destroying package of professional and personal betrayal. I clicked send. My second target was the media. A private war was not enough. This needed to be public. I had spent days researching the top financial journalists in New York looking for a shark. I chose a woman named Tara Lynn at the Wall Street Journal, an award-winning investigative reporter known for her tenacity and her meticulous sourcing. For her, the delivery method had to be different. It couldn't be purely digital. It had to have the weight and gravitas of physical proof. The night before, I had printed and assembled a full dossier in a crisp, professional binder. It contained the same evidence I sent to David, but it was framed with a carefully worded anonymous cover letter written from the perspective of a whistleblower within the investment community, someone horrified by Robert's unethical, high-risk practices. At 9:05 a.m., a bonded courier service I had hired, paid for in cash by a proxy Marcus had arranged in the city, delivered the sealed manila envelope directly to Tara Lynn's desk at the Wall Street Journal headquarters. The package was marked personal and confidential, to be opened by addressee only. And then I waited. For the first hour, there was only a deafening silence. I imagined the scene in that conference room. Robert, at the peak of his powers, his voice smooth and persuasive, spinning a web of projections and promises. Victoria, by his side, the picture of a bright, successful young partner, a testament to his new firm's youthful energy. Her father, John Elliott, sitting at the head of the table like a silent, powerful kingmaker, observing the investors he had brought to the table. At 10:17 a.m., my secure phone buzzed silently on the desk. It was a message from Marcus. Target 1 is active. Phone records show a 14-minute call from David Chen's personal cell to the head of litigation at Garrison Whitmore. The call was placed 8 minutes after you sent the email. My breath hitched. The first domino had fallen. David, a cautious, meticulous man, faced with his own potential ruin, had acted immediately and decisively to protect himself. He had sounded the alarm inside the firm. I kept my eyes glued to the news feeds, my finger hovering over the refresh button. For another hour, nothing. The waiting was the hardest part. It was a test of faith in my own strategy, in the power of the truth. I paced the length of my suite, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps, my hands clasped behind me. And then, at 11:43 a.m., it happened. A new headline exploded onto the Wall Street Journal's breaking news feed. It was a byline from Tara Lynn. Garrison Whitmore star partner Robert Parker under internal investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and Hudson Spire investor meeting thrown into chaos. The article was a masterpiece of controlled destruction. It was meticulously sourced and devastatingly precise. It detailed the allegations, citing documents provided by a confidential source and confirmation of an internal review from a senior partner at the firm. It mentioned the fraudulent mortgage loan, the embezzlement from a family charitable fund, and the misrepresentation of risk to his own partners. It was a neat, undeniable, career-destroying package of professional and personal betrayal. My phone buzzed again. It was Marcus. They know. All of them. The world knows. Get ready for the fallout. I walked back to the window.
It had started to rain, the drops streaking down the thick glass like tears. A few minutes later, I saw them. The elegant glass doors of the Seagram building burst open onto the sidewalk. Robert and Victoria stumbled out, looking dazed and shell-shocked, their faces pale. Robert was yelling into his phone, his face contorted with a rage that was impotent and pathetic. Victoria was standing frozen, her perfect composure shattered, as her father, John Elliot, stormed past them without a single glance, got into a waiting black town car and sped down Park Avenue. He had cut his losses. He had abandoned them on the pavement in the rain. They were alone, shipwrecked on the shores of their own ambition. And from my window, 38 stories up, I watched it all. I felt no joy, no triumphant cackle, just a quiet, profound, and final sense of closure. The curtain had fallen. The aftermath was a swift and brutal unraveling, a corporate implosion that played out in the headlines for days. The Wall Street Journal article was just the first wave of a media tsunami. By the end of the day, every major financial news outlet, from Bloomberg to Forbes, had picked up the story. The names Robert Parker and Victoria Reynolds were no longer associated with success and ambition. They were permanently branded with the scarlet letters of fraud and scandal.
Each message was another nail in the coffin of Robert's career, another shovelful of dirt on the grave of his reputation. His kingdom, built on a foundation of lies and stolen money, was crumbling with breathtaking speed. But the most satisfying, most predictable update came 2 days later. Victoria just hired a new lawyer, Marcus messaged me, the text followed by a smirking emoji. A top criminal defense attorney in New York. And it's not for Robert, it's for her. Of course. Faced with the wreckage, Victoria did what all creatures of pure self-interest do. She saved herself. She was the daughter of a billionaire. She wasn't going down with the ship. I knew with absolute certainty that she was, at that very moment, crafting a narrative with her high-priced lawyer, a story where she was the victim, a young, brilliant, but naive attorney who was manipulated and coerced by a charismatic, sociopathic boss. She would trade her testimony for immunity, offering up Robert's head on a silver platter to keep her own hands clean. The loyalty of thieves, I mused, lasts only as long as the spoils. I stayed in my suite at the Carlyle for a full week, a ghost watching the demolition of a life that was once mine. I read the articles, I watched the news reports on the financial channels, but I felt strangely, serenely detached, as if watching a movie whose ending I had already written. The white-hot rage had dissipated, leaving a vast, quiet, peaceful space in its wake. On my last day in New York, I did something that wasn't part of the original plan. It was an impulse, a need to connect with the part of my life that was still pure. I walked from my hotel to the small, elegant gallery in the Fuller Building that represented my mother's estate. A few of her paintings were on display in a quiet back room, serene landscapes of the California coast, canvases filled with an almost tangible light and color. I stood before one of them for a long time, a painting of a lone, wind-swept cypress tree clinging tenaciously to a rocky cliff, its branches shaped and gnarled by the relentless wind from the sea. It was her self-portrait in a way, resilient, enduring, unbroken. Looking at that painting, I didn't feel like Elizabeth, the vengeful wife, or Sophia, the strategic operator. I felt simply like Eleanor's daughter. And I knew what I had to do next. I walked back to my hotel, the image of the cypress tree burned into my mind, and picked up the phone. I didn't call Marcus. I called the woman I had hired months ago to be the new director of the Eleanor Memorial Fund, a bright, passionate art historian named Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah, it's Elizabeth Parker," I said. "Elizabeth, oh my God, I've been trying to reach you. I saw the news. Are you all right? What's going on?"
I'm more than all right, Sarah, I said, a real, genuine smile in my voice for what felt like a lifetime. I'm calling with good news. The funds that were misappropriated from the foundation, they've been recovered. All of them. There was a gasp of pure, unadulterated relief on the other end of the line. And there's more. I continued looking out the window at the New York skyline, no longer seeing it as a battlefield, but just as a city full of life. I've just liquidated some personal assets. I'm making a new anonymous donation to the fund, a significant one. I want you to expand the program, double the number of classes, find more shelters to partner with, hire another art teacher, whatever you need. Let's give as many kids as possible a chance to create something beautiful out of the chaos. The conversation that followed was about logistics, budgets, locations, hiring. But for me, it was the true climax of my story. It was the moment I stopped reacting to Robert's campaign of destruction and started my own campaign of creation. I was taking the poisoned money from our shared past and transmuting it, through an act of will, into something clean, something hopeful, something good. I was using it to honor my mother's legacy, not to fuel a war. That night, as I packed my single suitcase, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Robert's future was a bleak, desolate landscape of courtrooms, lawyers, and public disgrace. His punishment was his own doing. I had simply held up a mirror and forced him to look at his own reflection. My work was done. The next morning, I took a car to the airport. I wasn't flying west to hide in anonymity. I was flying home, back to California, back to the life that was waiting for me. I was no longer Elizabeth Parker, the wife, or Sophia Taylor, the LLC. I was just Elizabeth. And I was finally, truly, gloriously free. Returning to California was like stepping out of a pressurized cabin into the open air. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant. The air was different, smelling of eucalyptus and salt from the Pacific instead of the exhaust and rain of Manhattan. I didn't go back to the house, of course. That was no longer my home. It was a crime scene, a cold, marble-floored monument to a life I had shed like a snakeskin. I rented a small, light-filled bungalow by the beach in a town an hour down the coast, a place where no one knew my name or my story, a place where I could simply be. The legal cleanup happened at a distance, a series of satisfying echoes from a battle already won. I hired a sharp, no-nonsense divorce lawyer, a woman in her 60s with shrewd, tired eyes that had seen every form of human folly. I didn't have to tell her my whole sordid story. I just had to show her the evidence. I met her in her quiet, book-lined office and laid out the binder I had prepared. When she saw the file, the forged mortgage documents, the bank statements from the Eleanor Fund, the proof of Robert's hidden assets and his plans with Victoria, she looked at me over the top of her half-moon glasses. A slow, appreciative, almost predatory smile spread across her face. "Mrs. Parker," she said, her voice a low, gravelly purr, "this isn't a divorce filing. It's a surrender document." And it was. Robert, facing a mountain of legal trouble from multiple fronts, had no fight left in him. His high-powered, expensive lawyers, realizing the case was indefensible and that his considerable funds were rapidly evaporating into a black hole of legal fees, advised him to settle quickly and quietly. The divorce was finalized in record time. I got the house, which I immediately put on the market, and the entirety of my private investment portfolio, the Sophia Taylor funds, which my lawyer successfully argued were legally untouchable as they were built from my premarital inheritance. He was left with his debts, his disgrace, and his impending criminal trial. I never had to set foot in a courtroom. I never had to see his face again.
The criminal case against him was a different story, a public spectacle that I followed with clinical detachment in the newspapers and online legal journals. As I had predicted, Victoria Reynolds became the prosecution's star witness. On the stand, she wept, she expressed remorse, she painted a vivid, convincing picture of a manipulative, Svengali-like boss who had preyed on her ambition and coerced her, a young, brilliant, but naive attorney, who was manipulated and coerced by a charismatic, sociopathic boss. She would trade her testimony for immunity, offering up Robert's head on a silver platter to keep her own hands clean. The loyalty of thieves, I mused, lasts only as long as the spoils.
Robert was sentenced to 5 years in a medium-security federal prison. The primary charge wasn't for what he did to me, but for bank fraud and embezzlement. The system punished him for the crimes it could easily quantify, the crimes against institutions. But I knew his real sentence, the one that would last a lifetime, was the one he had given himself, the complete and utter demolition of his own life, his own name, his own ego. With the legal storms finally past, the skies cleared, and I began the slow, deliberate, joyful process of rebuilding. But I wasn't rebuilding the life I had before. I was building a new one, from the ground up, on my own terms, with my own 2 hands. I sold the big colonial house on the tree-lined street and all of its contents in an estate sale. I didn't want any of it. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every rug was tainted with the memory of his betrayal. The sale provided another substantial influx of capital, which I immediately poured into 2 things: a massive endowment for the Eleanor Memorial Fund, ensuring its work for generations to come, and the official launch of my own business. I officially retired Sophia Taylor LLC. My company was now, proudly and defiantly, Parker Designs. It was a reclamation of my name, my identity. I started small, taking on a few residential projects for new clients who knew nothing of my past and cared only about my vision. My work became my therapy. Creating order out of chaos, bringing beauty and light into empty spaces, felt like a perfect mirror of what I was doing in my own soul. I found a quiet, profound joy in the simple things: the smell of fresh-cut wood in a workshop, the texture of a new linen fabric swatch, the way the late afternoon sun slanted through a newly installed picture window. I worked hard, not because I needed the money, but because I loved the work. I loved the feeling of being capable, of being in charge, of seeing my own vision come to life, uncompromised and unfiltered. My life was no longer defined by a man, by a marriage, or by a betrayal. It was defined by my work, my friendships, my support for my mother's legacy, and the quiet, breathtaking satisfaction of a sunset over the Pacific Ocean, viewed from the porch of a small, simple bungalow that was entirely, unequivocally my own. I had vanished from Robert's world, and in doing so, I had finally, fully, gloriously appeared in my own. A year has passed since the day Robert was sentenced, a year of quiet healing and steady forward motion. The seasons have turned, the tides have come and gone, and the raw, jagged edges of my experience have been smoothed by time, like sea glass on the shore. Life has a quiet, steady rhythm now, a rhythm I set myself, a melody I compose each day. Parker Designs is thriving, more than I ever could have imagined. I've had to hire a small, dedicated team, 2 bright young designers who share my passion for clean lines, natural light, and creating spaces that feel like a sanctuary. We are currently working on a project that means more to me than any high-paying residential contract. We are redesigning the entire children's wing of the local public library, pro bono. We are creating a space filled with color, imagination, and cozy secret reading nooks,
a sanctuary for little minds to wander and dream. It feels like a fitting, tangible extension of my mother's work, bringing beauty and opportunity to the community. I don't think about Robert much anymore. He's a ghost, a faded photograph, a character in a story that's already been told. Sometimes a headline will catch my eye online, a brief mention of his upcoming parole hearing, or a "Where are they now?" piece on Victoria Reynolds, who, I read, is now living in quiet, wealthy shame back in her hometown, her legal career a distant memory. I feel no anger, no satisfaction, not even a flicker of schadenfreude. I feel only a profound, unshakable sense of distance. Their lives are their own, a tangled, messy web of their own making. My life is here, in the light, filled with purpose and peace. This afternoon, I was sitting at my drafting table in my home office, the window open to the sound of the surf, sketching plans for the library's new storytelling area. The mail arrived, and my assistant brought it in. Tucked in between the bills and the design magazines was a small, square envelope made of bright blue construction paper. My name, Ms. Parker, was written on the front in a child's careful, wobbly purple crayon handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a drawing. It was a picture of a woman with brown hair standing next to a large, colorful easel painting a vibrant, smiling sun. The colors were bright and joyful, spilling outside the lines with an exuberant energy. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful purple crayon print, were 5 words. "Thank you, Ms. Parker. Love, Maya." Maya. I remembered her name from a recent report from the Eleanor Fund. She was a 7-year-old girl at a local women's shelter, a star pupil in the weekly art class, a little girl who had found her voice and her joy in color and shape. Tears welled in my eyes, but these were not the hot tears of grief or the cold tears of rage I had shed in another lifetime. These were the tears of a deep, quiet gratitude. I looked at the simple, heartfelt drawing, and I knew with a certainty that resonated in the very core of my being that this was the real inheritance. This was the true return on my investment. Not the healthy number in my bank account, not the successful business, not the quiet satisfaction of seeing a bad man fall. It was this small, beautiful act of creation, this connection to another human being, this continuation of my mother's legacy of light. I stood up and walked to the large picture window in my office that overlooked the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of orange and gold and violet. It looked just like one of my mother's paintings. I thought about the entire journey, the fire I had to walk through to get to this quiet, peaceful shore. I realized that the greatest paradox of my story was that by vanishing, by making myself invisible to the man who refused to see me, I had to become more visible to myself than ever before. I had to lose a life that was a lie to find one that was true. My worth was never tied to his validation. My strength was never dependent on his approval. It was there all along, dormant like a seed buried in frozen ground, waiting for the thaw, waiting for me to reclaim it, waiting for me to remember the woman I was born to be. The fight was long and it was hard, and it cost me dearly, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat, because on the other side of that fight, I found something I thought I had lost forever, myself. And that is a victory no one can ever take away. My story is just one story. It's a reminder that our value is inherent, that our strength is often forged in the very fires that were meant to consume us. Thank you for listening, for sharing this space with me. The journey to reclaim oneself can often feel a lonely one. If my story resonates with you, If you've ever felt unseen, underestimated, or had to fight for your own worth, please know that you are not alone. I invite you to share your own thoughts or stories in the comments below. Let's create a community of strength, of shared experience, of lifting each other up.